Have you ever heard of a group of killers so depraved that their crimes blurred the line between murder and ritualistic horror? This is the disturbing case of the Chicago Ripper Crew, a gang of sadistic murderers led by Robin Gecht, who, along with Edward Spreitzer and brothers Andrew and Thomas Cocker-Elias, unleashed a wave of abduction, torture, and murder across Chicago in the early 1980s. Their crimes were not just about killing. They incorporated ritualistic mutilation, cannibalistic practices, and satanic worship, creating one of the most terrifying cult-like murder sprees in modern history. Stick around as we uncover the horrifying details of the Chicago Ripper Crew and the sick mind behind their reign of terror. During the early 1980s, Chicago was gripped by fear as a series of young women vanished without a trace. The victims were often sex workers, runaways, or women walking alone at night, seemingly disappearing from the streets, only to later be found brutally murdered, if they were found at all. Many of the bodies showed signs of extreme violence and mutilation, leaving investigators struggling to understand what kind of predator they were dealing with. Women were vanishing at an alarming rate, yet authorities had no concrete evidence to suggest a serial killer was operating in the city. Robin Gecht, the ringleader of the Ripper Crew, had once worked for serial killer John Wayne Gacy, though there was never any direct evidence linking him to Gacy's crimes. Gecht was obsessed with the occult and had developed a deranged belief system centered around satanic rituals and human sacrifice. He recruited 3 like-minded followers, Edward, Spreitzer, and brothers Andrew and Thomas Cocker-Elias, who quickly proved to be just as sadistic as their leader. Gecht presented himself as a charismatic figure, convincing his followers that their ritualistic murders were part of a higher calling. Their method was as terrifying as it was brutal. They would prowl the streets of Chicago in a red van, searching for women to abduct. Once they found a target, they would force her into the van at gunpoint and take her to a secret location, a house where Gecht had set up what he called an altar room. Here the true horror began. The torture was methodical and ritualistic. Victims were tied up, brutalized, and subjected to unspeakable horrors. But what made the Chicago Ripper Crew unique was the way they mutilated their victims. They would cut off their breasts as part of a sick ritual. Gecht believed this act held satanic power, and according to later confessions, he would keep the severed body parts in a wooden box, using them in twisted ceremonies. Some reports even suggested that Gecht forced his followers to consume parts of the victim's flesh, believing it would give them supernatural power. Some victims were murdered immediately, their bodies dumped in remote locations, while others were kept alive for days, enduring unimaginable suffering. Gecht's level of sadism went beyond simple murder. He thrived on psychological torment, ensuring that his victims felt fear, pain, and hopelessness before death. The crew carried out their killings without remorse, and with each murder, their bloodlust only grew stronger. For over a year, the Chicago Ripper Crew continued their reign of terror, attacking at random, making it difficult for investigators to see any clear pattern. At least 18 women were believed to have been murdered, though given the nature of their crimes, many believe the actual number was much higher. The randomness of the killings made it almost impossible for police to determine a suspect list. If this case is as disturbing to you as it sounds, take a second to like this video. It really helps the channel out. The case finally broke in 1982 when a woman named Beverly Washington survived an attack. She had been abducted, tortured, and mutilated just like the others, but miraculously, she lived. Found barely alive near a railroad track, she had suffered horrific injuries, but remained conscious long enough to describe her attackers. Despite her trauma, she was able to give police a description of the van and the men who had taken her, providing the first real lead in the case. Investigators launched a citywide search, and soon the Chicago Ripper Crew's carefully hidden operation started to unravel. A tip led authorities to Robin Gecht, whose name had come up in previous investigations involving missing women. As police questioned him, they discovered that his close friends, Spritzer and the Cockerice brothers, had criminal histories that matched elements of the crimes. Under intense interrogation, Edward Spritzer and Andrew Cockerice cracked first, confessing in gruesome detail to their crimes. They admitted to following Gecht's orders, explaining the satanic rituals, the mutilations, and how they had chosen their victims. They even led police to some of the crime scenes, describing exactly what had happened. They told investigators that Gecht saw himself as a satanic priest, conducting dark rituals that involved pain, suffering, and sacrifice. Robin Gecht, however, never confessed. Unlike his followers, he maintained his innocence, denying involvement in the murders despite overwhelming evidence. When police searched his home, they found the infamous wooden box lined with bloodstained fabric, but they never uncovered direct proof linking him to the murders. Gecht's cold and manipulative personality made him the most dangerous of the group. Even after his conviction, he showed no remorse or acknowledgement of the suffering he had caused. The trial of the Chicago Ripper Crew was one of the most disturbing cases ever seen in Illinois. Andrew Cockerice was sentenced to death and became the last person executed in Illinois before the state abolished capital punishment. Edward Spritzer was also sentenced to death, later commuted to life in prison. Thomas Cockerice was given a 70-year sentence, but was shockingly released on parole in 2019, sparking outrage from the families of the victims and the public. Robin Gecht, the mastermind behind it all, was sentenced to 120 years in prison, but because he never technically killed anyone with his own hands, he avoided the death penalty. To this day, he remains behind bars, never admitting to the full extent of his crimes. His refusal to confess, despite his followers turning against him, suggests that Gecht believed in his twisted philosophy until the very end. The Chicago Ripper Crews crimes remain some of the most gruesome and disturbing in American history. Their satanic rituals, horrific mutilations, and sheer sadism make them stand out even among the most infamous serial killers. How does a group of men come together and commit such atrocities without remorse? Was Robin Gecht simply a manipulative cult leader? Or were his followers just as depraved as he was? Let us know what you think in the comments. And if you found this deep dive compelling, subscribe for more in-depth true crime stories.